Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Victoria Bennion, founder of the Victoria Bennion podcast booking agency, where she works with expert business owners to build their brands and grow their businesses through leveraging podcast interviews. She's also the host of Best Guest podcast and is a co-author of the most amazing marketing book ever by Mark Schaefer and Friends. Welcome to the show, Victoria.
Thank you so much for having me, AJ. Great to be here with you.
Wonderful. Welcome to the show. Welcome to India in this online form. But I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will be able to benefit from what you are we'll be talking about how to leverage podcast interviews to best effect. So, Victoria, to understand from you, and we will come to the before the interview part, how to be a good guest and all. In terms of a lot of podcast guests, many are able to get good interviews with good podcast hosts, but then they are not able to actually utilize that output.
Yes, that's right.
And that is a challenge. That becomes a challenge even for podcast hosts because they can only amplify within their audience. And their biggest grouse is that the podcast guests are not sharing it enough, whereas the guest wants to share it but do not know how. So that is why I also saw that checklist on your website. So I will certainly check that out later on, but you talk about that also. How can podcast guests make use of output that they have worked so hard to create, leverage it fully to build their brand in whatever they are doing?
It's one of the huge benefits I think about being on podcast interviews is if you're a busy entrepreneur or author or coach or something, and you're running your business and you're doing these podcast interviews, it's actually providing you with all this fresh content, which with a little bit of effort can provide you with content for all your social media channels. You can turn your interviews into blog posts. You can repurpose them into your newsletter content. And I think, what you were talking about, sharing the show. I mean, it's so important that the guests do share the show because that's in everyone's interest, really. It's in the host's interest, but also if you as the guest share the show, more people are going to listen to what you had to say. The podcast is going to grow. And it's, rising tides lift all boats. It helps everybody. So I think it's really your duty when you're a guest on podcasts that you do your best to promote the episode. So that's start with sharing the show when it goes live. Usually the host, I don't know what you do, AJ, but usually the host will create the post and tag you in it. That's the first thing. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So make sure that you're connected to the host before the interview so that you're ready to go. So if the host tags you, you're ready to share it. So that's the easy one. That's very easy to do. Beyond that, you can create social media posts that go out over the course of the week. You really want to, have a campaign set that promotes your episode at that point. So you can pull out quotes. You could, if you don't want to just sort of say, listen to me, you could generally promote the show. Perhaps like AJ, you've done, if I listen to your show, you've interviewed some other great guests. You could do a post that's saying, I was interviewed by AJ and, you should really check out this episode he did, like you did with Erin Curran recently. That was a great interview that I think that as my audience, you could benefit from that. So if you don't want to just be pushing yourself, there's other ways you can promote the show and then they'll find you as well. But that helps the host, and the host puts in so much work to growing the audience. So that makes you a great guest too. And, there might be them ways that you can further your relationship with the host, build upon that. Maybe they'll invite you back. It's in everyone's interest that you're a great guest. But as we were saying, you could pull out quotes and make audiograms with the host permission, obviously. If you're happy to do that, you can just do quote graphics that you share. There's so many different ways. And I was talking to a great social media expert recently on my podcast called Doreen, and she was talking about even if you change the graphic a little bit for the show, you change the colours, you think that you can be bombarding people with posts, but actually very little is seen. So just by making tweaks to how you're sharing it, people don't always realize, and you're still driving traffic. And then of course you can do clips, you can do clips, video shorts for your YouTube channel, you can do much longer form content. Particularly if what you talked about is something that you are trying to rank for on your website, it's worth you putting the effort in, or having someone help you to create a blog post, maybe from your podcast interview. And again, this gives you something to talk to your newsletter subscribers about too. So really your podcast interviews can be your core content that you can then do so much with for your platforms. And really, like, you know, it could take you half an hour a week to show up. And if you've got people that can help you, it can help you with managing the time of creating all these assets.
Absolutely, absolutely, Victoria. I wanted to ask you, you have answered that very, very well, almost like a step by step thing that the guest can do to leverage their podcast best. Why I wanted to bring that question, up front, because most of the time we talk about what can be done to get into a good podcast or to the podcast of their choice, but normally we don't talk about what they can do with the final product. And the funny part is, I'll tell you what you mentioned, that you must connect with the guest before the show, not after the show. What happens is, many a times I want to help the guest, tag them into the shows, but many a times I found that you can't do that because they have not allowed anyone to add on Facebook. How
Yes.
do you do it? So after some time, you may try once, but you will not keep on trying that. So
That,
you, even if you want to keep it private, you must at least tag them before the show. Maybe
yeah.
later on you don't want to continue, it's okay. Or at least you can continue with the podcast Facebook page, the company page. That will be of benefit to you. And so there are so many ways, they can make use, or be pillion riding the wave, yeah, that the host has created at that point in time, and later on you can also add to it. So that is why I wanted to bring to. So this brings to my question in another way is, then what makes a bad podcast guest?
Oh, what makes a bad podcast guest? Okay, so I would say, obviously, I come from it from both sides of the mic, being a host as well. So it'll be interesting to compare this with you. But so a bad guest, I would say for sure, is late, maybe. So it's a really good idea to log in a few minutes before your interview, or if the host sends you a note, just reminding you, checking in that you're going to be there, particularly if it's a live like we're doing today. Make sure that you acknowledge that so that everybody knows where they are and that you aren't keeping the host waiting. Because if it's a live, then obviously you've got to fill that somehow. If the guest doesn't show up or is late, sometimes there's prep things to go through for a few minutes before. Everybody wants to check their technology's working. So in terms of being a podcast guest, I would say be early. That's a good guest, number one. If you have time to listen to a couple of episodes of the show, so you have some familiarity with the structure and the style, I think that can be helpful. When a guest shows up and they've just got no idea who the audience is and haven't taken the time to think about that, that's not the most helpful. And one of my real bugbears, or something that we've also spoken to hosts about, is when someone comes on and their mindset isn't to add value, it's not to entertain, it's just to push their product, to talk about their product or their service, buy. And I've spoken to hosts before, I don't know if you've ever come across this, where they've had interviewees and they haven't been able to use it because it was just so bad, because it was just so pushy and salesy. So they're probably three of my things. And of course, sharing the show. I think that makes you a good guest.
Absolutely, absolutely, Victoria. Now let's go a bit backward into, that in terms of a lot of people have know about podcast marketing and are using it, but as we said that how to use it best. But a lot of people still, this is a new line, this is a growing area as a great marketing tool, and a lot of people may have heard about it but they haven't used it. So
Mm.
what would you like, you are a founder of a booking podcast booking agency, so that will be also informing a lot of people also that how can people actually, especially businesses, individuals, use podcasts in building their brand, that this is the tool, or this is the marketing tool, this is the thing that can be used best without costing you anything, maybe a little bit of money for the podcast agency which is working so hard for you to get you to the right podcasts. Tell us how they can actually do it. What is it that is there in it, in podcasts for them?
Okay, there's so many benefits to being a guest on podcasts, and I think one of the preconceptions that we come across often is that people will think of it as similar to mainstream media. And, you know, how big is the show? How many listeners does it have? But actually, the great thing, there's so many great things about being a guest on podcasts. So you've got the networking that you do with the hosts, and that's great. And sometimes, you know, these relationships can be so beneficial to building your business. The host could be in a really aligned area with you, and there might be opportunities for joint collaborations. We see this with our clients all the time. The podcast interview is often just the first step, and if they connect really well, you know, sometimes they go on to do webinars for the host community, or they do lives on social media. Some of our clients have gone on to speak at hosts events that they were organizing because they're a good fit. So you get that time with someone that you wouldn't necessarily get. You can't always ring up another business owner and just be like, hey, do you want a coffee? But yet you're doing that same, you're having that time, aren't you, to connect. So there's that one, there's the networking. There's podcast interviews where they're usually sort of 20 to 30 minutes, maybe longer. It really gives the listeners the time to get to know you, the person behind the brand. And we find that, you know, our clients often connect with listeners. It will be on something personal, they said, maybe. Like, I've got a client who's very mad about cats, and she talked about cats, and she's a coach. And a listener came to her having heard her on the podcast and needed a coach. But the reason she chose our client was because she was a cat lover too. And it's that connection that you're able to build through, you know, showing you. I think that's can be really powerful. It also helps build your authority. So if somebody Googles you and then they see all these podcast interviews come up that you've been on, not only can they see that you are able to talk about your subject well, but they can click on the interview even months or years down the line after you've done it, and they can hear you. And it often really shortens that sales process. Listeners can come to you pre-sold. And another thing I think is worth saying about podcasts are generally smaller numbers compared with mainstream media. And this is where a lot of the confusion arises. But you can really sort of be so laser focused with your marketing and talk to the right people. So you can get, by being on podcasts with niche audiences, you can get your business, get yourself in front of people who are actually interested in it, which is far more valuable, I think, than talking to a vast number of people with only, you know, a fraction that might have any interest in what you have to say. We have a client, and she helps widows with their finances, and we booked her on some very niche shows. And you know, she said that as soon as one of the interviews went live, she got a client immediately, because also the audiences can be really engaged with these small podcasts too, and you're getting that endorsement from the host. So if they're invested in the host and they show up every week and the host brings you on as a guest, it's this endorsement. And again, that can really shorten the sales process. As we talked about, podcast interviews give you all this content that you can repurpose. And also you will often get exposure to a wider audience. So the host can share it maybe on their social media channels or to their newsletter subscribers. And sometimes these numbers are even bigger than the download numbers. of the show. So just a huge number of benefits. I totally recommend it.
Absolutely, absolutely. You talked about very, very well about download numbers. It's all about engagement. I'll tell you what. I go live on YouTube, on LinkedIn. Right now we are also going on Twitch, which is for the younger lot. So just like I'm trying to build up some sort of a presence there, so that all this good business talk also reach to the young people, and that is what. But the big thing you talked about, audience. So people only look at, and that's a mistake, to see that okay, these are the download numbers, and this is what it is, because they don't know the type of engagement that is happening on another platform, like on LinkedIn. The engagement is huge. As an individual content entrepreneur, as a podcast host, you don't have so much of energy to just push one interview on one particular say channel like YouTube. It needs a lot of hard work to do that, but a lot of attention will come to you on a platform like LinkedIn if you actually notice it.
Yeah, for sure.
And that is where people can use it the best way possible. Like, see, you trained as a journalist before moving into marketing, and that now, right now, where you are as a podcast, running a podcast agency. In journalism, we used to talk about those days, 15 minutes of fame. Here
Yes.
it is more than 30 minutes of fame, and the
Yes.
full spotlight on you. What better do you want for yourself, isn't it?
Yes, completely. I love that 30 minutes of fame.
Yeah, absolutely. More than that, many a time. So I
Yes.
guess a lot of people, the smart people, will come to know, and I'm sure that is what you are telling to your podcast guests also, to make use in the best manner. But these are my observations as a podcast host. I've done more than 500 interviews, so I've got some learnings
Wow.
out of 500, more than 500 live interviews. So I've got some learnings how these things work. And one of the things is that many a times, guests become overly salesy. That does not work.
Yeah.
And so I come to the point where you talk about a wrong call to action, and that is, when guests can use
Mhm.
wrongly in a podcast interview. I hope it's not the same point that you have earlier said. If it is a different one, please share for the people, so that they know what wrong call to action they should not use on a podcast interview.
Okay, so firstly, a call to action is usually at the end of the interview when the host says, "Where can listeners go to connect with you?" or something along those lines. It's then what you say, that's your call to action. So, this is a great opportunity for you to encourage listeners to take that next step in the relationship. So, ideally, you want wherever you send them to be free of charge. So just somewhere that you can connect with them further. So what we really like is a welcome page. So if you create a page where you can have a couple of offers on that page, maybe a couple of free guides, like for example, I have one, and I'll give your listeners, if they'd like, a free Canva template for a one sheet that they can use, a free checklist on how to be a great guest, ways to connect, a link to our podcast with some tips on how to be a great guest, that kind of thing. If you do that and personalize it for each podcast interview that you're on, you only have to share one URL, which just means that listeners only have one thing to remember. Because often, I don't know about you where you listen to your podcast, but sometimes I'm driving or I'm out for a walk and I don't have a pen handy. I might remember to go back to the show notes, but if you can make it easier for listeners to just remember where to connect with you, I think that's great. And then it also gives you're able to track visits if you set up a personalized page too. So that could be something you want to do, because that can just be one benefit. A bad call to action. Yeah, so and make sure your URL isn't too complicated. So you don't
Absolutely.
want you don't want it to be extra complicated. Yeah. So I think that's my main tips.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that podcast checklist, I'm sure, will be very handy for people. I will certainly give that link on the show notes, so that people are able to, reach
Oh,
to
thank
that
you.
that podcast checklist, and are able to make the best use of that. Now, coming down
Yeah.
to your podcast, you are the podcast host of the Best Guest podcast. What is it all about? So that people can learn more from you directly and from your podcast itself.
Sure. Okay, so I created the Best Guest podcast in October 2021. And it was really when I started working with clients and booking them as guests on podcasts, I thought it would be really helpful if they were able to have a practice session with us first. So, you know, all those things when we were talking about being a good guest. So one of those things is knowing how your equipment works. So if you can have a run through, sometimes that can be really helpful. And also if you might be feeling nervous, or you might have just new topics that you want to test out. So that's one of the reasons that we created it. Another one is that it gave us a platform to actually talk about, you know, how to be a good guest, how to talk about the strategy, so that anyone who's thinking of being a guest on podcasts, there's just lots of useful information about how to show up, you know, how to repurpose your interviews, what your call to action should be, those kind of things. And then we bring on experts as well who have anything, you know, that to add that can really support that. So perhaps if your call to action is to send listeners to your Facebook community, we might bring on experts that talk about how you grow a Facebook community as well. So yes, so it's kind of, I guess, a three-pronged attack.
Right. So what is, and you know, what is the best way for people to, you know, connect with you and learn more from you, and also, you know, so that they can engage with you professionally? A lot of guests need a lot of good hand holding.
Yes.
I come across a lot of guests, podcast guests, who have not been trained very properly, and they come and make mistakes, and then I never call them again. But I'm
Yeah.
sure a lot of people want to have good people doing their work for them and to handhold them properly. I'm sure that's why they will be very happy to connect with you.
Oh, thank you. Yes, well, if any of your listeners want to connect with me, I've set up a page for them specifically, which is www.victoriabennion, spelling on the screen, .com
Right.
/AJ.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So with this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, AJ.